All right, in our discussion of faith and reason, we were asking the question, do we need to have arguments to prove the existence of God? And we saw that Scriven says yes, and Aquinas says, well, fine, I've got arguments. And Plantinga says, no, you don't need any arguments. Well, now we want to turn to the question, are there any good arguments for the existence of God? And the first kind of argument for God's existence, which we're going to look at, is the cosmological argument. Now, actually, there are many different versions of the cosmological argument, and we're just looking at one kind, a very simple kind. There are much more elaborate sorts. Cosmological arguments argue from the existence of the world, like the cosmos, that's where it gets its name, from the existence of the world to the existence of some ultimate cause of the world, which we can call God. Now, when I say that they argue from the existence of the world, what I mean here is the universe, everything in the physical space-time world. This is not just an argument about the origins of, say, the planet Earth. It's bigger than that. Really, cosmological arguments are trying to provide an answer to the question, why is there something instead of nothing? Why does anything exist at all? And the answer it gives is there's some ultimate cause, which we can call God. Now, cosmological arguments are not intended to defend a particular religious view of creation. So this is not a philosophical argument in defense of, for example, the Genesis account of creation. Furthermore, cosmological arguments are not concerned about, say, the origin of life or of human beings or the laws of nature. They're not asking why does this or that specific thing exist? What's the cause of this or that particular organism or part of the world or feature of the world? They're asking why does anything exist at all? That's what the cosmological argument is about. Now, there's kind of three main types of cosmological arguments in this family of argument. There's the argument for a first mover, and Aquinas makes three versions of this kind of argument. We're not going to look at his. There's the argument for a first temporal cause. That's what you might call a Kalam style argument. And we're going to be looking at that, an argument for a first temporal cause. A contemporary defender of this kind of argument is William Lane Craig. You can Google him and find tons of his stuff on the internet. A third kind of argument, of cosmological argument, is the argument from contingency. And the argument from contingency was defended by people like Gottfried Leibniz, who also invented calculus, and Samuel Clarke, and it's got contemporary defenders as well. We're going to look at the Kalam style argument. Here's the basic idea of the Kalam style argument. Basic form. Everything that begins to exist, it would say, has a cause of its existence. But the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence, which we can call God. Now, this is basically the kind of argument that Nagel presented as the cosmological argument in your reading. And it's also one that I think is pretty intuitive to a lot of people. Where did all this come from in the beginning? It had to come from somewhere. It's got to be God or something like God. This particular form of it that we're going to look at originated with a Christian philosopher named John Philoponus who lived in the fifth and sixth centuries, and he was arguing against Aristotle. But it got picked up and revived by Islamic philosophers in the Middle Ages, and then came back into kind of broader circulation. Its most well-known contemporary defender, like I said, is William Lane Craig. Kalam is an Arabic word meaning something like, I think, philosophy. So that's where it comes from. All right, so let's look at the argument here. The first premise says everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Now, I think that's probably the least controversial premise. You may not believe it, and many people dispute it. However, here's why it's kind of very plausible. it seems like things don't just start to exist for no reason or without any cause. It seems like they come from somewhere. There's a reason that they occur. There's some kind of cause. It seems like science presupposes, in fact, that when you observe some phenomena, it's got an explanation, one that we can discover. There was some cause that brought it into existence. For example, you exist right now. Did you just pop into existence from nowhere? No, you had a cause. You had your parents, right? Your parents caused you. Um, the same thing. Right now you're looking at a computer. Did your computer just pop into existence from nowhere? No, it had a cause. And there's a tree out in the yard. Where'd the tree come from? Did it just pop into existence? No, it had a cause that brought it into being. So, and science seems to presuppose that everything has a cause, an explanation. That's at least a plausible reason to think that premise 1 is true. The most debatable premise is the second one, this claim that the universe began to exist. That's very debatable. After all, maybe the universe has just always existed eternally. Maybe it goes back and sure, it goes to the Big Bang, but before the Big Bang, maybe there was some, infinitely concentrated bundle of energy that had just always been there. Or maybe it came from some other pre-existing physical state that we don't know about. And maybe there was just an infinite chain of events that has always been happening. Why should we think that the universe began to exist? Good question. Here's how the Kalam cosmological argument goes. It gives further arguments in defense of this claim that the universe began to exist. So, here's the basic structure of a defense of premise 2. If the universe had no beginning, then there has been an infinite series of causes and effects that stretches back into the past. Now that premise right there is true just by definition. By definition, if the universe had no beginning, it's been infinite. The action here is in premise 1.2. An actually infinite series is impossible. That's the claim. Well, if that's true, that an actually infinite series is impossible, then it follows by modus tollens that the universe had a beginning. It's false that there's been an infinite series of causes and effects. Again, the controversial premise is 1.2. Why should we think that an actually infinite series is impossible or paradoxical? And the defenders of the Kalam argument have given a whole bunch of different kinds of arguments or reasons for saying that an actually infinite series is impossible. I'm just going to tell you one of them now. Now, in your reading, Nagel doesn't even spell out what any argument in support of that claim might be. He kind of skips the actual interesting parts of the Kalam cosmological argument and just says it's absurd. But and as a matter of fact, the defenders have made important arguments. Here's one. The argument is that it's impossible to add to the infinite. So 2.1, nothing is greater than infinity. Again, this is supposed to be true by definition. You can't have a number that's bigger than infinity. Infinity plus 1 is just infinity. And so you can't get bigger than that. Now, the number of past days becomes greater each day. And that proves that the number of past days is not infinite. All right, let me try to explain this for a second. Okay, here's a picture of what this argument is trying to say. This first picture up here is supposed to be a timeline of the universe where the universe has a beginning, a point. It's not infinite in its past, but it keeps on going forever. The second picture down here is supposed to be what an infinite universe would look like. It goes on forever, but it's also been around forever. It had no beginning. And this argument is trying to say that this picture here is impossible. Here's why. Now let's say we're talking about yesterday, Thursday, October 3rd, 2019. How much time has gone by in history up to that point? Well, an infinite period of time has already gone by. Well then, how much time has gone by today, one day later? It's been one day more of time than had gone by on Thursday. That means it's infinity plus a day time that's gone by. But you can't have a quantity that's greater than infinity, because the premise said nothing is greater than infinity. So that's impossible. It's impossible that an infinite period of time had already elapsed on Thursday. It must have been only a finite period of time, which means the universe must have had a beginning at some point. Otherwise, today could never have happened. That would make history longer than infinity. So that's the basic idea of this argument, is to raise paradoxes regarding this kind of picture of the world. Now, of course, there's many objections have been made to this kind of argument. Here's just a couple. Here's one that Nagel made. Look, it seems like infinite quantities are obviously possible because we work with them in math all the time. It's just not true that an actually infinite series is impossible. That's just ignorant of how the way math works. Maybe so. There's more discussions to be had on that point, but it's obviously a good point to raise. Here's another objection which Nagel doesn't bring up, but which was discussed a lot in the 18th century. If the universe can't be eternal, then that seems to mean that God can't either. I mean, if God is infinitely old, which is what I think most theists in the West want to say, that God is eternal, then there's no reason that the past history of the universe couldn't be infinitely old either. But if you want to say the universe can't be infinitely old, then it seems like God couldn't be either. And so you'd have to deny God's eternity. So that's another issue. Now, Nagel makes a couple other assertions which he's just confused about, and so I want to point these out. He says that if everything has to have a cause, then God has to have one too. And if not everything needs a cause, then the world doesn't need one. That's, I think, a confusion about the argument. Theists don't typically claim that everything needs a cause. They want to say that only a certain kind of being needs a cause. For example, in this argument, things that begin to exist. But on their view, God doesn't begin to exist, and so God doesn't need a cause. Nagel says that theists usually respond that God is self-caused. That's just not true. Theists typically say that God is uncaused, not self-caused. Theists have typically thought that self-causation is a contradiction that makes no sense. So Nagel kind of strawmans the argument at a couple points. Things to think about here. Do you think that the universe is eternal, or that it began to exist at some point in the distant past? Why or why not? And if you think it began to exist, do you think it had a cause, or just popped into being without any cause or explanation? And if you think the universe did have a cause, what do you think that cause must have been like? And why?